Two 6-year-old twin girls were sold by their stepfather right in front of an abandoned church, as if they were broken goods. No one stopped him, no one asked questions, until a wealthy man showed up and said, "From now on, they're mine." The early winter wind slithered through the cracks of the decaying walls, making the old church groan with a sound both tired and sorrowful, like the sigh of a soul long forgotten. Hazel stood still, her bare feet turning purple from the cold against the moss-stained stone floor. Her hand gripped Wren's tightly, not out of fear, but because if she let go, there might be nothing left to hold on to. Caleb, their stepfather, didn't need to shout. He never had to. Just a lazy shove, a lifeless stare. Like he was discarding two unsellable items. He tossed a crumpled bill onto the dusty wooden pulpit, then turned and walked away, decisively, cleanly, as if closing a cheap transaction. The church doors slammed shut behind him. The cold swept in, so sharp it needed no judgment. Silence alone was enough of a sentence. No one came to ask. No one tried to stop him. In the crumbling main hall, a few silhouettes sat in the back. A man dressed like a pastor, eyes closed as if in prayer. An elderly woman, head bowed, lips sealed. They didn't object. They didn't interfere. They simply let the children be left behind, as if it were just another part of the service. Wren, 7 years old, one Lunar New Year younger than Hazel, shivered in the cold, but she didn't cry. She bit her lip and softly asked, "Hazel, did he just sell us?" Hazel didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because saying it out loud would make it real, like chains locking around their lives forever. They sat down in a corner. Hazel took off her only sock, full of holes, and slipped it onto her sister's foot. Wren's feet were swollen and red, the wounds still open, never healed. Caleb called them lessons for not listening. Their mother had cried once, but tears never stopped the pain. Wren rested her head on Hazel's shoulder. Her voice was as soft as rain. "Do you think someone will come for us?" Hazel didn't speak. She no longer had the courage to lie. Time passed. The church stayed cold, still, silent. The wind whistled through the cracks, like a reminder. No one is coming. Until a car engine outside. No honking, no shouting, just the quiet hum growing fainter, then stopping. Silence followed. Then the sound of a door opening. Software steady. The church door creaked open. A man stepped in. He wore a long coat dusted from the road, tall, lean. His face was weary, but his eyes held something gentle, something that hadn't died yet. His hair was streaked with grey, like someone who had lived more than one lifetime. Hazel and Wren stared at him, wary. Men showing up unannounced had never been good news. But he didn't approach quickly, didn't bombard them with questions, didn't burst through like someone claiming ownership. He simply moved gently, like a man who had learned how not to startle anyone. He stopped a few steps away, said nothing, just looked. Not judging, not pitying, almost as if, once, a long time ago, he had sat exactly where they were, waiting for someone who never returned. Wren spoke first. "Mister, are you lost?" The man tilted his head slightly. His voice was deep and slow. "Maybe. But if I am, this isn't the worst place to stop." Hazel stepped in front of her sister, her voice firm. "You got anything? Candy? Rope?" "No," he said, without a hint of threat in his voice. "Just a car, a few blankets, and a place where no one yells in your ears." He slowly sat down. He didn't move closer, just lowered himself to the same cold ground, as if he understood that no one trusts someone who stands too far above them. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a full sandwich, a small water bottle, and a packet of disposable warm wipes. the kind people use for kids in the winter. He didn't rush to give them. He waited, just a second, as if asking with his eyes, "Is this okay?" Then gently set each item down on the floor. Ren stared at the sandwich, didn't touch it. "If we go with you, will someone be waiting for us?" "No," the man answered. Then, after a quiet breath, "But no one will be hitting you either." From inside his jacket, he pulled out something small, a worn-out teddy bear keychain. Not new, but clean. He placed it next to the wipes and added softly, like a quiet confession, "My son used to hold this when he was scared of storms." Hazel whispered, like repeating an old curse, "We're not used to people who don't hit." The man didn't argue. He didn't reassure. He just opened the rear door, letting in the pale afternoon light. Not warm, but enough to see that outside the wind was blowing. Not to knock them down, but maybe to help them move forward. "The car's unlocked," he said, not trying to convince. "If you want, you can sit inside. There are blankets. And the radio. It plays classical music." Ren looked at Hazel. Didn't ask, just squeezed her hand. Then, for the first time, she was the one who pulled Hazel to her feet. Hazel looked at her sister, then at the man. His eyes were like wind over a desolate field, lonely but never abandoning. The two girls stepped out of the old church, bringing nothing with them but each other. The door closed behind them. No promises, no goodbyes. But ahead, there was a man waiting. Not to rescue them, but to stay. Long enough for trust to grow. Elias Marchand, a widowed millionaire, once lived in a mansion filled with rose gardens and piano music. But his wife and child died in an accident he survived. His memories didn't. Since then, he'd left behind the glittering world, wandering as if trying to repent with every mile. He wasn't a hero. He didn't save people, but he knew this. When a child is shivering from the cold, the first thing to do is to sit beside them and let your presence bring back the warmth that life had taken away. The car rolled slowly over the gravel path, leaving behind the abandoned church, its dim lights and the sound of wind slipping through rotting wood. Hazel sat by the window, her spine stiff as a wooden plank. Beside her, Ren leaned on her shoulder, eyes barely open, not to see, but to stay alert. Every movement was quiet, as if the world might shatter if someone so much as dropped a word. Elias didn't glance in the rearview mirror, but he knew. The girls had just left a place that wasn't quite hell. Only worse, because no one dared admit it had ever existed. The suburban house appeared beneath the shadows of old trees, slanted roof, aged window frames, and a lone pine tree standing like a silent sentinel. No fence, no gate lights, just stillness, thick like the dust that hadn't been touched in years. As soon as the car stopped, Hazel opened the front door. She didn't need help, but once outside, she turned back and offered her hand to Ren. Her sister took it without a word. Hazel's limping stride didn't confuse Ren. They had walked like that for years. Elias didn't extend a hand. He simply opened the door to the house and stepped aside, giving the girls space to walk at their own pace. Inside, there was nothing remarkable. Old wooden floors, the scent of dried cinnamon, and the warm glow of a single lamp. Elias spoke softly, not as a command, but as a choice. "Pick wherever you'd like to sleep." Ren's eyes moved around the room, then looked to Hazel. No one asked permission. Hazel walked to the rug near the fireplace and placed her hand down, not to see if it was clean, but to feel if it was safe. Ren understood instantly. She dropped her worn-out backpack beside it. A footstep echoed from the hallway. Miles appeared, holding a wooden cane, walking steadily, patiently. "Hi," he said. "I'm Miles. I can't see—" But you don't have to stay quiet. Wren froze. She tightened her grip on Hazel's hand. I don't know what to say, Wren mumbled. Miles sniffed the air. You just walked through mud, didn't you? Wren nodded, then remembered he couldn't see. Yes. No need to confess. The mud told me. Hazel moved slightly closer, eyes wary. But instead of tensing, she let go of Wren's wrist. A small gesture, but real. After dinner, warm soup and crispy toast, Elias led the girls upstairs. The room had a window overlooking the hill, moonlight gently spilling across the wall. No pictures, no dolls, just 2 neatly folded blankets and a small lamp on the table. "Good night," he said, closing the door gently, no lock clicking behind him. Wren curled close to Hazel. "If no one wakes us up to wash dishes tonight, maybe this place isn't so bad." Hazel didn't answer, but she pulled the blanket over both of them, holding her sister's hand tightly. That night, Elias stepped out onto the porch and made a phone call. A man's voice answered, deep, drawn out, sweet like honey mixed with dust. "Elias Marchand, this is Ray Duval. I heard you're housing 2 little girls." Elias tightened his grip on the phone. "What do you want, Ray?" Now, no need to be so tense. I just thought, maybe I could help. There are families willing to take them in. Good people, strict but kind. Kids like that need structure, Elias. Discipline, something they probably never had. Elias's voice went cold. "I didn't buy them, Ray, and I'm not handing them off to anyone who treats them like property." Ray's voice grew slower, softer, but filthier. "I get it. You're compassionate, but compassion won't keep them from unraveling. When they start acting out, you'll see. Trust me." Elias hung up without hesitation. At the top of the stairs, Hazel stood still. She didn't understand everything, but that man's voice, it felt familiar. The way he spoke about children, as if they were pets, as if she and Wren could be handled. Her chest tightened, her hand searched the wall, looking for an escape in the dark she already knew too well. The next morning, a soft knock on the door. Elias set the coffee pot down and opened it. Father Thorne stood there, worn hat pulled low, holding a warm bag of apple pastries. "The girls, okay?" he asked, his voice rough but warm. Elias nodded and invited him in. They sat at the kitchen table, light filtering through the frosted window pane. "Pope Francis passed away," Father Thorne said softly, his expression solemn. Elias bowed his head slightly. "He once said, 'God doesn't choose the perfect. He chooses those who are willing to listen.'" The priest paused, then glanced around the home. "And I believe this house is listening." At the stairwell corner, Hazel stood, not hiding, not interrupting, just standing there as if those words were something she needed to remember, more than what was for breakfast. Miles invited Wren to play chess, the blind version, each piece marked with unique textures, every move announced aloud. "A 3 to E5, Wren said, testing. Miles nodded. "Good move." Hazel sat nearby. She didn't join in. She adjusted Wren's socks with careful hands. No one asked her to. No one rushed her. But when Wren giggled after being checkmated, Hazel's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. Maybe not joy, but the first breath of relief in many days. And just like that, from the silence of that first room, other doors began to open. Not big ones, just tiny cracks, letting the light slip through. One moment of trust, one moment of being heard. Then, one new way of seeing yourself. As the first light of morning clung to the cold eaves, Elias already knew. Today could not be just another ordinary day. He drove Hazel and Wren to the local health clinic. The car moved gently along the misty back road, lined with rows of old trees standing still like statues. No one spoke. At every turn, Hazel gripped the door handle tighter, as if her body still remembered what her mind tried to forget. Wren sat close beside her, eyes fixed on the window, though her thoughts were somewhere far away. The clinic was small, its paint peeling in large patches. Elias parked, stepped out first, and opened the door for the girls. No rush, no hollow encouragement. Wren stepped out first, then turned to help her sister. Hazel limped slightly, not making a sound, but Wren's eyes stayed locked on the swelling at her ankle. Every step was a reminder of what they had already endured. Nurse Samira Patel, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, greeted them with a gentle smile. She didn't say anything cliché. She simply looked into each girl's eyes, as if silently asking, "Are you really here?" While Hazel was being examined, Samira gently touched the bruises around her knee. Hazel didn't flinch. But when Samira pressed lightly around her ankle, Hazel recoiled, gripping the edge of the table. "Have you treated injuries like this before?" Samira asked. Hazel nodded, said nothing. Samira paused, her eyes softening with quiet grief. "You did it yourself, didn't you?" Hazel nodded again, her back straight, as if admitting it wasn't sorrow, but duty. Samira went still for a moment, then gently laid a hand on Hazel's hair. "You did well, but you're not alone anymore." Hazel looked up, just for a second, then clenched her fist. No one. She needed no one. But an image rose in her mind, like a blade from the past. Her small hand wrapping a bandage around her sister's bruised back. That night, Caleb hadn't thrown the glass at anyone, just into the air. But the bruise landed on Wren. Samira asked no more. She rested a hand lightly on Hazel's shoulder, soft enough not to startle her. In the waiting room, Elias sat among scratched plastic chairs. Wren sat beside him, quietly playing with a loose thread on her shirt. After several minutes, she whispered, "If we're not good, will they send us back?" Elias met her gaze, voice low and firm. "I didn't buy you. I welcomed you." Just 5 words. But Wren's shoulders relaxed, not because she believed right away, but because she wanted to believe. A fragile hope, yet strong enough to keep her sitting there. On the way home, Elias stopped by a small bookstore on the corner. In the car, Hazel looked out the fogged window, while Wren counted the streetlights along the sidewalk, a quiet game to make time move easier. Elias returned with a paper bag. Inside, a dark brown leather notebook and a raised ink pen. "Is it for me?" Wren asked. "It's for whoever needs to write what they can't say." That afternoon, Miles found Wren sitting cross-legged on the porch. She opened the notebook and placed the pen on the first page. Her handwriting trembled, but it was clear. "Not everyone who takes you in keeps you. Not everyone who keeps you says your name. But whoever says your name right might be someone worth staying for." Miles touched the edge of the notebook and smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Inside, Hazel was talking with Samira, who had returned to help guide care for her ankle. As Samira was about to leave, Hazel stopped her and tugged gently at her sleeve. "If someone hurts—" "Here," she said, placing her hand over her chest. "Pressing right next to it helps, like when I hug my sister." Samira stood still, then smiled softly. "You think like a real nurse." That evening, while Elias was cleaning up in the kitchen, Sister Agnes knocked at the door. The elderly woman wore a charcoal-grey knitted scarf and carried a basket of pastries, warm and scented with cinnamon. As she entered, her eyes caught sight of a plastic jar on the table. Inside it, a few wildflowers, placed unevenly by Wren. Doesn't have to be pretty, just needs someone to notice. She sat next to Wren, who quickly hid the notebook behind her back. Agnes didn't ask. She simply spoke, almost to herself. Pope Francis once said, "A child doesn't need to be perfect to be loved. They just need someone to call them by their name." Wren looked up, blinking fast, then turned to Hazel, and for the first time she said clearly, "I'm Wren, Hazel's little sister, and I'm here." No applause. But from inside the house, Elias looked on, eyes quiet, nodding once. That night, Hazel helped Miles wash the dishes. She stood by the sink, small, but not shrinking. "If, I want to learn new things, will Mr. Elias make me?" Miles tilted his head. "Here, wanting is enough." A week later, Hazel carefully wrapped a small cut on Miles's hand. When Samira visited again, she paused at the doorway, watching Hazel apply medical tape with quiet precision. "You know how to keep an injured hand steady?" "Perfectly." "Who taught you that?" Hazel replied, "I watched." And I remembered. Because if I don't remember, I can't help anyone. Samira placed a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the ones with scars are the best at healing others. The house was still quiet, but no longer the kind of silence filled with waiting or fear. This was a silence with rhythm, like the scratch of pen on rough paper, like bare feet crossing wooden floors, like eyes meeting without needing to speak. The things no one had taught them, Hazel and Wren were learning on their own, step by step, word by word, with people who never demanded they be perfect. And so, life began to take a shape. Not just something to survive, but something that might finally be worth staying for. One morning, just like any other, as Elias was tidying up the backyard, the distant sound of a small truck's horn echoed. He looked up just in time to see Mr. Bingham step down, an old plumber Elias had trusted for years but hadn't seen in a while. "Your roof groans like a toothless old man," Bingham chuckled, heard it from 2 blocks away. From behind the curtain, Hazel saw a tall, lean man with a worn tool bag slung over his shoulder, walking slowly, almost as if checking every brick beneath his feet. He wore an old baseball cap. His movements weren't rushed. Each one seemed meant to listen, to feel something moving inside the walls. Elias stood at the door, still holding his gardening gloves, watching his old friend. A quiet sense of gratitude welled up in him. Something about someone returning, not for obligation or show, but because the roof still needed keeping warm. Elias had always believed there was no such thing as coincidence, only life gently stitching pieces back into place. And this morning, Bingham was one of those pieces. Hazel came out and sat on the front steps. Her eyes followed every move. Mr. Bingham didn't notice her watching. He kept working, sometimes placing his ear against a copper pipe like he was listening to whispers from behind the wall. "Leaks always start small," he said, without turning. "Just like sadness. If you don't pay attention, by the time you notice, it's already flooding." Hazel didn't answer, but she scooted closer, sitting just at the bottom of the stairs, her fingers fiddling with the corner of her shirt. Wren and Miles were playing at the end of the hallway, but Hazel stayed behind, quiet, learning to listen. "Want to try?" Mr. Bingham held out a short piece of metal pipe. "Put your ear here, like a doctor listens to a heartbeat, except this is the house's." Hazel followed his lead. Through the cold metal, she heard a faint dripping, tiny, almost non-existent, unless you were looking for it. But it startled her, not because it was loud, because it was familiar. It was the sound of the faucet in their old bathroom, where she used to rinse cloths and wrap bandages around Wren's bruises after Caleb's rages. When Samira had once told her, "You're good at caring for wounds," Hazel had clenched her fists. Now, she did again, not from fear, but from memories that still wouldn't stay quiet. Mr. Bingham watched her for a long moment, then said gently, "You've got a good ear, kid." A little later, Elias stepped outside with a cup of tea for Bingham, but paused as he saw Hazel's gaze shift toward the fence. Mrs. Kendra, the neighbor, was standing right there. So, even Mr. Elias plays the hero now. What a performance, she scoffed, her voice sharp as rusted wire. Wren instinctively stepped behind Hazel, but Hazel didn't hide. She stood firm, locking eyes across the fence. She didn't say a word, but something in that look made Mrs. Kendra hesitate, just for a second, then turn and walk back into her house. Mr. Bingham saw everything. He said nothing, but as he walked past Hazel, he gently laid a hand on her shoulder, a touch like a quiet nod. By afternoon, Hazel was still by the leaking pipe, sitting beside Bingham. He taught her how to listen, not just with ears, but with silence. That some things aren't said aloud, but if you're patient enough, they'll come to you anyway. That night, Hazel didn't fall asleep right away. She took Wren's notebook and pen and wrote, not a poem, but a drawing, a house with long, clean pipes, no leaks. Beneath it she wrote, "Those who listen can fix." Then, for the first time, Hazel knocked softly on Elias's door before bed. She didn't speak. She simply handed him the drawing, then turned and walked away. Elias took the paper, read it. His hand trembled slightly, not because the writing was uneven, but because of what it stirred in him. Memories of the years he spent trying to listen to himself, but too late to hold on to his first son. He placed the drawing inside the drawer, next to old photos of Miles, making it, in his quiet way, a part of the house. Then he exhaled, for the first time that day, a full breath. Honest. Nothing held back. Out in the hallway, Wren was sitting cross-legged on the rug, her back to the wall, carefully folding a paper crane. The first one was crooked. By the third, her folds were sharp. "If I fold 1,000, she whispered, "do you think Hazel will be able to dream?" No one answered. But in the next room, Hazel rolled over, pulled the blanket up. And sleep came easier than it had in nights past, because that day, from a sound as faint as dripping water, she had learned how to listen, not with her ears, but with presence. And for the first time, she saw. A house doesn't need to be new, only real enough not to fall apart when someone finally leans on it. The morning began with pale light spilling through the kitchen window and the quiet chime of a clock from the next room. Elias buttoned a crisp shirt and carefully adjusted his old tie in the mirror. Downstairs, Hazel was helping Wren tie her hair. She didn't say much, but her hands moved through Wren's curls as gently as mist. Wren wore a pale blue dress Miles had picked out the week before. "You look like the sky before a storm," he'd said. From the hallway mirror, Elias watched the two girls. Each morning had become a lesson in fatherhood for him, not in duty, but in tenderness. "Ready?" he asked. No rush, no pressure. "Do you want to bring milk?" he asked Hazel. She shook her head. He gently patted her shoulder, then turned to Wren. "Don't forget your notebook. Today matters." The car pulled up to Riverbridge Elementary. Inside the main office, Elias sat across from Principal Nora Blight, whose gaze was as sharp as a polished desk. She skimmed the file and set it down. "Mr. Elias, I appreciate your good intentions, but we cannot accept a student with a history of instability. This is not a place to experiment with compassion." Wren sat outside in the hallway, her legs swinging above the floor. She heard everything. Each word dropped into her chest like stones into cold water. Too unstable. Not a fit. She clutched the straps of her backpack tighter. Clarabelle Dawes, the first-grade teacher, walked by and paused. She looked at Wren. Small, thin, messy hair, eyes too dry for tears. Not afraid, just waiting to be turned away again. Clarabelle stepped into the office just as Elias stepped out. "Has the girl ever attended school?" she asked softly. "Not formally," Nora replied, "but she seems very alert." A mix of reaction and silence, Clarabelle noted with a faint smile. That's the language of a child who's learned how to survive. That afternoon, Wren said nothing on the ride home, but that night she sat quietly next to Miles and wrote in the notebook he'd given her, "If someone listens, my words will have a place. If someone believes, I won't need to scream." That night, Elias stood alone on the porch. He pulled out his wallet, his fingers brushing over an old photo. His first son, Aidan, who died at age 8 from asthma complications, after Elias missed a follow-up appointment for a meeting he thought was more important. He had never forgiven himself. Whenever he heard a child gasp for breath, he could still hear Aidan calling out in the rain. Aidan had once scribbled on a sticky note, "I'm not scared of pain. I'm scared of being forgotten." Elias had kept that note in his wallet for years, and now, tucked beside it, was a newer message, written in Wren's handwriting. "I don't need anyone to apologize for the past. I just need someone not to hurt the present." The next morning, Clarabelle let Wren sit at the back of her classroom. No roll call, no notice to the principal, just a simple, "Have a seat. I need another listener for story time." Wren wrote her first essay, "Why Children Deserve to Be Heard." Clarabelle sent it to the school newspaper. 3 days later, it was printed and read by everyone. Parents began to talk, not out of fear this time, but out of feeling. One posted the essay on the local community page with the caption, "Words from a 6-year-old that made me ashamed of adult silence." A local radio station invited Clarabelle to speak. In her interview, she mentioned the children labeled too much for the system. Children don't need to be rescued. They need to be heard as part of the community. The following week, under growing public pressure, Principal Nora signed a special waiver allowing Wren to enroll. At the next flag ceremony, Clarabelle read aloud a portion of Wren's essay. "We don't need to be good to be heard. We don't need to be perfect to stay. We just need a door that isn't locked." After the assembly, a printed copy of the essay was pinned to the bulletin board, alongside a quote from Pope Francis, "Children are not problems to solve. They are gifts to welcome." Wren didn't understand the full weight of what had happened, but she did notice something that morning. Someone smiled at her on the playground. Clarabelle said, "You can keep writing if you want." Wren asked, "Do you think I deserve to be here?" Clarabelle knelt, so their eyes were level. "I don't need to think. You're already here." Hazel waited in the hallway. When Wren came out, Hazel asked quietly, "Was it okay?" Wren nodded, then whispered, "No one called me a burden. First time." Hazel didn't smile, but she held her sister's hand the whole walk home. When Elias heard the news, he took a printed copy of Wren's essay, folded it into quarters, and tucked it into his wallet, right beside the last letter his wife had written him. He ran a hand gently across the page, as if it were another letter, not from the past, but from a future still in the making, because sometimes a single line from a child is enough to fill the space someone left behind. That afternoon, Hazel sat under the porch roof, slowly reading Wren's essay aloud. She said nothing after, but her eyes no longer looked stretched like tight wire. Elias sat nearby, silent. He didn't interrupt. He simply placed a glass of milk and a sharpened pencil beside her, then stepped back into the house, leaving the two girls beneath a roof just wide enough for a new beginning. As the wind shifted, Wren pulled out another sheet of paper and wrote, "I'm still scared, but being scared doesn't mean I'm wrong." Hazel kept that paper, and when night came, she placed it under her pillow, next to a broken hair clip, the last thing left from their old home. Not to hold on to the past, but to prove that no matter where you come from, everyone deserves a tomorrow to begin again. Where are you right now as you read this? In a quiet room, among a crowd? What did you feel when Wren asked, "Do you think I deserve to be here?" Share your thoughts in the comments below, because maybe what you're feeling now is the light someone else has been waiting for. The night rain had lingered, leaving the schoolyard soaked with puddles that hadn't had time to dry. Wednesday morning began with a familiar silence in Wren's chest. Not peace, but the thin shell covering something she didn't yet know how to name. In the long hallways of Riverbridge Elementary, wet shoes left smeared footprints across the floor. The bell rang. Inside the classroom, Clarabelle was reading a fairy tale, her tone steady but warm. Clarabelle Dawes, a woman in her early 50s with salt and pepper hair tied neatly at the back, always wore long-sleeved sweaters and carried a worn leather bag. She wasn't the kind of teacher who smiled often, but her eyes always found the quietest children in the room. To Clarabelle, the most concerning student wasn't the one who pushed back. It was the one who never asked questions. During recess, Wren walked the hallway, watching a group of older kids gather near the far end of the yard. Toby and Jace, two names younger kids whispered with unease. Today, their target was a younger boy who stuttered and had a scar along his left hand. He was trying to protect a comic book as it was being ripped from his grip. "Give it!" Jace yelled, holding the book above his head. Give it back!" the boy snapped, his voice cracking like thin glass. Toby smirked. "You can read? How? Do the letters run away from you?" Wren didn't know the boy, but she knew that feeling, that you weren't allowed to keep anything for yourself. Without thinking, she stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "Give it back to him." Toby turned, raising an eyebrow. "Well, look who's talking. The princess, without a castle." Jace didn't joke. He shoved Wren. She fell hard, her knee scraping the wet concrete, a sharp burn, blood rising. Her legs had never been steady, and now they barely held her. From a distance, Hazel saw everything. She wanted to shout, but her body froze. Her injured leg kept her from running. Old fear gripped her like rotting roots. Before the boys could do more, Clarabelle's voice struck like lightning in midday. "That's enough." She walked over, not rushing, but with a presence that froze the air. Toby and Jace backed off. Clarabelle helped Wren up, checked her knee, then looked at the crowd gathering like a silent courtroom. "Today, everyone will write an essay. What I saw when someone was bullied." No one objected. There was no need for debate. Wren was brought to the nurse's office. Hazel was already there, like she'd known something was wrong. Samira, the school nurse, gently disinfected the wound. Clarabelle quietly stepped out, leaving the sisters alone. "You did really well, Wren," Samira said. "Hazel, could you hand me the bandage?" Hazel handed it over, quickly and accurately. Samira paused, studying her face, then smiled. "You're very good at taking care of others." Hazel froze slightly, her hand clenched. A memory surged, old cloth wraps, bruises on Wren's back, the sharp smell of alcohol from Caleb's shirt. No one had taught her how to bandage wounds. She learned because no one else would. Hazel said nothing. She simply knelt, looked at Wren's knee, and placed her hand gently over the bandage. For the first time, her touch wasn't defensive. It wasn't trembling, just a touch, as if to say, "I see you. I'm here." That night, Elias sat at his desk. In front of him, a copy of Wren's essay Clarabelle had sent with a message. "When someone's bullied, people like to say, 'That's not my problem.' But today I saw, if you turn away, you're helping the bully. I'm not strong, but I don't want to be weak by staying silent." Elias sat for a long time. He remembered his first parent-teacher meeting for his late son, Aidan. The one where he had fought with the teacher, believing Aidan had been unfairly judged. But he'd been wrong. Not because Aidan was weak, but because Elias hadn't known how to listen. The phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then picked up. "Elias," a man's voice said, smooth, syrupy, false. "It's Ray. You might not remember me, but I helped Caleb. Clean up a few messes. Heard you've got those 2 kids now." Elias tightened his grip on the phone. "I can help make this go away. There are people looking for well-behaved children. You know what I mean, right?" Elias hung up without a word. On the stairs, Hazel had heard just the last line. She didn't understand it all, but her eyes sharpened. That old instinct rising again, the one she thought had finally faded. A week later, someone was seen lurking outside the front gate. Elias had installed cameras in advance. When a large figure hovered near the old pine tree, Elias sighed and stepped out onto the porch. In his hand, an old hunting rifle. Never fired, but enough to remind whoever it was that this wasn't a place where children could be taken. The man vanished before the police arrived. Time passed. Wren's essay spread throughout the school. Other teachers began weaving anti-bullying themes into their lessons. A small bulletin board was set up near Clarabelle's classroom. On it, quotes from students were pinned. One read, "Bullying doesn't seem like a big deal, unless it's happening to you." Clarabelle walked by, her finger brushing over the note. Her eyes weren't wet, but something heavy fell in the way she stood, like someone who had witnessed too much pain, ignored for too long. Hazel read the note slowly, as if decoding a secret message. She stood there for a long time. Elias saw her. He didn't interrupt. He simply understood. Sometimes it's not about pushing someone forward, just not standing in their way. That evening, as Elias shelved books in the family library, his eyes landed on a dusty leather journal, his late wife's. On the first page, in her handwriting, "Raising a child isn't about making them like you. It's about helping them never be afraid of you." He closed the book and exhaled. Back home, Wren told Miles what had happened, in fragments, little by little. Miles didn't say much. He just nodded, then handed her a small wooden box. "This is for you," he said. "Whenever you're scared, write it down and put it in here. You don't have to show anyone. But once fear has a place to live, it doesn't have to live inside you anymore." Wren opened the lid. Inside, a few folded notes. She didn't ask questions, just wrote on the first slip. "Today I fell, but I didn't run away." Hazel saw it. She stepped forward, and in what seemed like the smallest gesture, she placed something into the box too, a broken hair clip, a relic she'd never shared before. Elias watched from the hallway and suddenly understood. Healing doesn't always come through words. Sometimes it lives in what we keep, even the broken things, to remind us that we've survived. From a single fall, Wren stood up, not because someone helped her, but because she knew someone saw her. Hazel no longer protected with just her body. She was learning to heal through her own scars, and for the first time, they weren't just victims. They were proof that quiet strength doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, landing softly on the dark wood table where Hazel sat, stitching the torn seam of an old shirt. Each time the needle passed through, Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from relearning how to do something not for survival, but simply to preserve what mattered. Elias stood at the sink, quietly watching. He didn't interrupt or give instructions. He watched carefully, as if afraid to disrupt this rare moment of focus. Miles came down from upstairs, holding a small wristwatch without hands. "It doesn't work," he said, "but I keep it. My mum once touched it." Elias didn't say anything. He simply nodded. Wren ran in from the backyard, her hands covered in dirt, but her face lit up with joy. "I grew a sprout," she shouted, lifting a tiny pot like a trophy, clumps of soil scattered across the rug. Elias didn't scold her. He knelt and wiped the floor with a cloth, then said, "Next time, knock with your knee, if your hands are full of life." Breakfast was laid on the table. No one rushed. Hazel sat beside Wren, quietly scooping rice onto her plate. Miles began telling a made-up story. "My mum's hair smelled like mint. I couldn't see her, but I remember the scent. When I was little, I'd lie next to her and listen to her heartbeat. I thought it was the sound of a clock trying its best." Hazel pulled a small knitted bracelet from her pocket, faded grey. "I think maybe your mom made this. Not sure, but if you want it." She placed it in Miles's hands. He held it with both hands, like he was carrying something fragile. That afternoon, Elias drove alone to the old church. Father Thorne was sweeping leaves, slowly and steadily, as if it were more ritual than chore. They didn't speak for a while. Then Elias sat on the steps, eyes resting on the cracked stained glass. "They're starting to laugh," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I deserve to hear that sound." Father Thorne didn't turn around. He replied with a quote from the book lying beside him. "Silence is prayer, when there are no words left to say." Elias looked down at the cover, Pope Francis. He gently touched the bookmarked page, then laid a file on the table. Hazel and Wren's medical records. Under Legal Guardian, the name Caleb was still listed. Elias drew a single line through it. He didn't replace it with his own, just left a question mark. "I don't want anyone else stepping into their lives the way he did," Elias said. "I won't add a name unless it means something. I want them to choose it." Father Thorne smiled softly, like wind brushing against leaves. "That's the only kind of name worth giving," he said. In town, word of the two children continued to spread. Not as gossip, but because of Wren's essay, still being passed from hand to hand. A group of parents came to Elias's home, bringing used books, clothes, and toys. "This isn't charity," one said. "We just want them to feel like they belong, like any other kid." Mrs. Eloise Tiller, the librarian, brought a hand-drawn map. "I marked the library, the park, and the bakery with the best cake, so the kids know there are more paths than the one that led them to fear." Even Mr. Bingham sent back the old lantern he had repaired, this time with colored glass panels. "At night," he said, "it'll cast shapes on the ceiling, to remind them there's still light, even when there's no power." Late that night, Elias sat at his desk, rereading his late wife's journal. On a nearly final page, she had written, "If one day our child asks, 'Why don't we have as much as others?' Answer, 'You don't need to have enough to be worthy of love.'" He closed the journal, eyes resting on the handless watch on the shelf. And for the first time, he didn't see it as broken, but as a reminder. Some moments aren't meant to be measured in minutes. They're measured in what is healed during the quiet. On another afternoon, Hazel paused by the window, watching the yard. Elias was speaking with a man in plain clothes, the local sheriff, an old friend. They exchanged papers. Hazel couldn't hear them. But when Elias came inside, he knelt down to her eye level and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I want you to know," he said, "if he ever comes back, Caleb, The one who leaves will be him. Never you. Never you. Hazel didn't speak, but for the first time she didn't look away. She didn't step back. As for Caleb, when he heard a millionaire had taken in the children, a quiet fury rose, not from affection, but because he saw them as lost property. He reached out to a different broker, Ray Duval, but this time Ray declined. Elias isn't easy to fool, and last time I got burned because of you. I still want to live. Rejected, Caleb began wandering near the town, but every time he approached the house, Elias spotted him first. Police were always called in advance. One night, Caleb returned to the old bar he used to haunt, but the new owner had changed everything. No one wanted him there anymore. On a quiet evening, Hazel placed the handless watch into Miles's box. "It doesn't tick," she said, "but it keeps its own kind of time." Miles touched the face of the watch and nodded. "Just like you." Hazel smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a strained smile, just a soft curl of the lips, because nothing was holding it back anymore. At the end of that day, Elias sat in the reading room. He looked at a photo of the 3 kids taken in the backyard under fading sunlight, and he asked himself, how long does it take for a child to believe they're no longer a thing to be owned? No one had the answer, but Elias knew this much. Time wasn't measured in years anymore, but in breakfasts filled with laughter, scrapes that were gently cared for, and eye contact that no longer flinched. The handless watch still sat on the shelf, a witness to moments when love returned, quietly, like a heartbeat that no longer feared itself. It didn't tick, but it kept time. Just like the 3 children who held on to what they thought they had lost. Among the relics that once seemed broken were memories being redefined, not as the things that shattered them, but as the very things that gave them the courage to love again. The town's sky felt compressed, like it was holding its breath. Clouds sank low over rooftops. No one knew the morning would be different, except for the plainclothes officers who moved quietly, like shadows retreating from a porch at dawn. Caleb Renner was arrested on the porch of his rotting wooden house, the same one where he once abandoned Hazel and Wren like trash. His wrists were cuffed behind his back. He flailed, snarling like a cornered animal. "I didn't do anything wrong. They're my kids. I have rights," he shouted, jaw clenched as if he could grind the world into dust. But this time, no one listened. The same neighbors who once averted their eyes, who turned away when they saw him drunk and screaming at children, now stood behind the iron gate, silent, not afraid, disgusted. The click of the handcuffs echoed, cold and final, like the lid sealing shut on a long era of violence. Big Ray Duval, a broker hiding behind charity work, confessed everything in a bid for a lighter sentence. Caleb came to me not long after his wife died. He brought photos of the girls and asked, "Can I sell these two?" Said the older one limps, the younger's sharp, like a snake. I joked, "You sure you won't miss them?" He said, "I'd miss the bottle I just smashed on the floor more than I'd miss them." One punch to Hazel's stomach left no bruise, but she didn't eat for 3 days. Every time Wren tried to protect her sister, Caleb yanked her by the hair, dragged her across the floor by her sleeve. Old clinic records from Samira's desk showed Hazel had once patched a deep cut on her upper arm, 6 centimeters long, using medical tape and scraps of cloth. She'd never been taken to the hospital. Caleb had said, "Hospitals cost money. You're not worth that much." Wren had been locked in a kitchen cabinet, her hands tied with a dishcloth for screaming too loud when Caleb swung a belt at Hazel. No one witnessed it. No one stepped in. But now, every word Ray confessed struck like a blade. Against himself, and the man he once called a client. For the first time, Caleb had no voice left. The news reached Elias through a phone call. He was in the kitchen with Hazel, baking. Ren sat at the table, coloring. Elias didn't react right away. He set the phone down, turned to the girls, and said, "They arrested Caleb." His voice was quiet, meant to be heard only once. Hazel paused, eyes blinking. Not joyful, not sad. Just a blank look, like someone had reached out and touched a memory that still had sharp edges. "I don't want to go to court," Ren said, her eyes never leaving the page. Elias walked over, knelt to meet her gaze. "I understand. I believe you. And I think the truth doesn't need to prove itself anymore." Ren nodded. Only Hazel noticed what came next. Ren's small hand reached out, gently taking Elias's. Her first unspoken answer, "It's safe here." The next day, Hazel returned to the old church with Elias. In her hands, a carefully folded letter. No one urged her. There was no music, no preaching, just the dust-covered pulpit and broken pews. The place she had once been left behind, as if she weren't worth choosing. She placed the letter down. She didn't speak. We don't forgive, but we don't hate either, because hate is still holding on, and we want to let go. Father Thorne read it the next morning. He folded it, pressed it to his chest, and looked up at the fractured stained glass window. "The most beautiful answers," he whispered, "aren't the ones that are right. They're the ones that heal." In the days that followed, the town buzzed with the news of Caleb's arrest. But what shook people even more was what the children didn't do. They didn't scream, didn't smear his name, didn't seek revenge. They were quiet, quiet like fire. Not the kind that blazes, but the kind that slowly, surely, burns rot into ash. Samira, the nurse who once bandaged Ren's wounds, came to the house when she heard. She wrapped Hazel in a hug and whispered, "You're stronger than anyone in this town who's ever worn a badge." That night, Elias reopened the adoption papers. In the previous guardian field, Caleb Renner's name sat like a scar. Elias took a pen, drew a line through it, but didn't write his own name in. He left it blank. They'll write in the name that deserves to be there. On a chilly evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. Ren told Miles about her dreams. Dreams where no one yells, no one hits, just me, lying on grass, not having to look over my shoulder. Miles smiled. "That dream's already real. You know that, right?" Hazel stood, walked into her room, and returned with a broken hair clip wrapped in folded paper. "I used to keep this because it was the only thing I had left. Now I keep it to remember what I made it through." Elias lowered his head, hiding a tear that never quite fell. Then he said, not to anyone else, but to himself, "We made it. Not because we were lucky, but because no one in this house ever stopped believing in each other. Justice didn't come from vengeance, not from punishment. It came in eyes that no longer flinched, in shoulders no longer tense, in voices that didn't need to yell. It came from one quiet truth. We are here. Not because someone let us be, but because we are enough to stay." Early autumn arrived, and the leaves began to change color. A soft layer of pale yellow covered the wooden steps in front of Elias's house. Ren sat arranging dry leaves into a circle, one hand clutching a stack of papers at her side. Hazel sat nearby, learning to use the mini sewing machine Samira had given her. Each stitch a lesson in creating something not for defense, but for sharing. Elias brewed tea, pouring it into 3 old mugs he had kept since his wife's time. The one with a small crack was his. The raccoon-printed one belonged to Ren. The light grey one, with a slightly loose lid, was Hazel's. There were no disputes. Everything had been quietly understood over time, needing no arrangement. Miles was reading to Wren. Though his eyes couldn't see, his voice guided the words as if he had seen the scene in a dream. He read about stars and told that a star was born not in the sky, but in someone's palm when they dared to hold on to the light. Hazel didn't show a clear reaction, but when the sewing machine made a soft click, she looked up, glanced around, then gently placed her first creation, a piece of fabric edged with golden thread, into Wren's palm. "It's for you," Hazel said softly, "to place under the paper cranes, so their feet won't hurt." Wren said nothing, but she bowed her head low, as if to hear more clearly something Hazel hadn't said aloud. In the afternoon, Elias took Hazel to the library. Librarian Eloise Tiller was rearranging books on the shelves, greeting Hazel with a nod, just enough to grant permission without making her uncomfortable. Hazel held a list of book titles written in Miles's firm handwriting. She didn't want anyone to read for her, not because she didn't trust them, but because she was trying to take a small step on her own without clinging to anyone. Eloise handed her a book titled "Things No One Teaches, But We Must Learn." No illustrations, not colorful, but the first page bore the line, "For those growing up through survival." Hazel chose a seat by the window. A gentle breeze slipped through the glass. She began to read, unhurried. Her eyes lingered on passages about compassion, boundaries, and forgiveness, not for others, but for the peace she needed herself. An hour later, Elias returned. He sat across from her, not asking, "What are you reading?" simply saying, "Here, if you want to stay silent, I'll sit with you." Silently. Hazel looked at him. Her eyes didn't avoid his. No defense. Then she slid the book slightly toward him, a silent invitation. At home, Wren was helping Miles mend old book pages. Miles guided her through each step. When a page tears, don't force it straight. Let it curve a bit, then tape it. That way the spine won't break. Wren followed his instructions. Her small hands were smoother now, no longer calloused from constant scrubbing as in previous years. "Do you think people are like that too?" Wren asked. "People are even more fragile than books," Miles replied, "so they need to be mended not with glue, but with time." Clarabelle visited, bringing 2 new notebooks. She sat down, reading Wren's latest draft. In it, Wren wrote, "Someday, I might forget the name of the person who scared me, but I'll never forget the first person who gave me a pen, instead of teaching me to defend myself." Clarabelle smiled, placing a hand on Wren's shoulder. She didn't correct a single mistake. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real enough not to need polishing. In the evening, the whole family sat around the dinner table. Elias recounted an old story about the time he and Aidan argued over a dropped ice cream. "That day," he said, "my son wasn't upset about losing the ice cream, but because I didn't look him in the eye when he cried." Hazel set her spoon down. A moment passed. Then she said, "I hate crying alone." Wren paused. She looked at her sister, then nodded gently. Elias didn't ask further. He simply stood up, fetched an extra blanket, and placed it over the 2 girls' shoulders. So today, if there's a need to cry, no one has to cry alone. The next morning, Elias took the whole family for a walk by the lake. No plans, no clear destination. Hazel walked in the middle, one hand holding a notebook, the other holding Wren's hand. Miles listened to the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, recognizing the familiar path. On the lake's surface, the wind stirred ripples like inner waves. Hazel watched a wild duck leading its ducklings. No one spoke. But later, in Hazel's notebook, there was a pencil sketch, a small duck following its mother, limping, but not left behind. Below the drawing was the line, If no one leaves anyone behind, even the weakest can reach the destination. Elias received a letter from the Child Welfare Office. Inside was a form requesting the completion of the official adoption process. He looked at it for a long time. Then he signed, but left the desired relationship section blank. He turned to Hazel and Wren. "I don't want to be someone you have to take the name of. I want to be someone you choose, if one day you wish to." Hazel didn't respond. But when a light rain came that afternoon, she stood up, took a piece of paper, and wrote, "Elias is the first person I've seen who doesn't demand my gratitude. That's why I'm grateful." Wren folded the 99th paper crane. She placed it in a wooden box beside unsent letters and half-written notes. She turned to Miles. "I don't know if my wish is right, but I think if the wish is for someone else, it can't be wrong." Miles nodded. He reached out, gently touching her hair. "You don't need certainty. You just need to keep believing." Hazel finished sewing her first handkerchief. She folded it, placing it in Elias's jacket pocket, not as a gift, but as a signal. "I don't say it, but I see." Elias found the handkerchief that evening. He didn't ask, just folded it, placing it in his wallet, next to Wren's first article and Aiden's last note. A week later, the trial of Caleb Renner and Ray Duval took place. The media wasn't allowed inside, but within the courtroom, testimonies from Samira, medical records, handwritten statements from Wren and Hazel, and Elias's testimony were enough to convict. Caleb was sentenced to 25 years in prison for child abuse and human trafficking. Ray received an 18-year sentence for child brokerage and legal obstruction. Neither would have the chance to approach the children again, not just because of the law, but because an entire community stood up to protect them. After the trial, Mrs. Kendra, the neighbor who once spoke harshly, waited for Elias at the gate. She held a basket of warm bread. "I know. Saying sorry now isn't enough," she said, her voice trembling, eyes red. "But I was wrong. Wrong to think silence meant not being involved. When I saw them being left behind, I turned away. Not because I didn't see, but because I was afraid I'd have to change. I hope the children can forgive me. Not to ease my conscience, but to have a chance to make amends." Elias said nothing, but Hazel stepped forward, taking a small loaf. "This one's for Wren," she said. "If you're sincere, you can come visit, but don't talk too much. Here, people listen through actions." Wren stood beside her sister. She didn't smile, but for the first time, she nodded at the woman. Kendra said no more. She just bowed her head, then slowly walked away. But in her eyes, something had been released, as if someone had lifted the burden of prolonged silence. And so, a day passed without incident, without shouting, without needing anyone to apologize, but leaving behind something that, years later, Hazel would write. "It was the first day we lived, not to escape, but to stay." From an ordinary day left behind to a journey with no turning back. That journey isn't measured by steps, but by the quiet changes in each person's heart. When a child can sleep without fearing being woken for punishment, when a cup of tea is poured not out of politeness, but love, that's when we know pain no longer controls everything. But the past doesn't simply end. It always leaves behind question marks at the end of each memory, and sometimes the best way to answer them is to let the children write the rest of the story themselves, with new names, with the decision to stay, and with a final chapter that is soft, quiet, and beautiful, exactly the way they deserve it to be. 10 years passed. The house that had once been a temporary refuge for 3 broken children was still quiet, but no longer the kind of silence that held back breath and braced for hurt. Now, It was the stillness built by warm meals, honest words, and enough silence to hear each other breathe. Hazel, now 16, was tall, slender, and calm-eyed. She was studying nursing, working part-time at a community clinic, the same one where Samira once worked. Ren, 15, had become a well-known young writer. Her articles appeared in youth publications known for their clarity, honesty, and lack of pretension. Miles, still blind, was now a part-time music instructor at the town's art center. He taught not with his eyes, but by helping his students learn to listen to themselves. And Elias, the once lonely millionaire, had long stepped away from business. He lived simply now, raising chickens, growing tomatoes, and every afternoon he still brewed 3 cups of tea, one for himself, one for someone missing Aiden, and one for anyone who needed a place to sit without being asked too much. One morning, the old church, where Caleb had once abandoned Hazel and Ren, was reopened after full restoration. No one had thought it would ever come back to life, but it was Hazel who first wrote the letter calling for donations, with a simple message: "Not everyone has a place to begin, but if the place that hurt us can be repaired, maybe our hearts can be too." Ren hosted a small talk in the courtyard of the newly restored chapel, now with bright red tiles and fresh stained glass windows. She read a quote once cited by Pope Francis: "God doesn't choose the perfect, He chooses those willing to listen." Then she added in her own voice, "We are not perfect, but we listen to each other. That's why we're still here." The entire town showed up. In the front row were Samira, Clarabelle, Mr. Bingham, Librarian Eloise, and Mrs. Kendra. This time, Kendra sat right beside Miles, holding his hand as he walked to the stage. Elias was honored with a special service award for his care of at-risk children. When he took the microphone, he simply said, "I won't accept a title, because what I received from them outweighs any award. Their survival, their growth, and the way they chose not revenge, but to stay. They raised me." A week later, Hazel, Ren, and Miles sat together on the stone bench in the backyard. Ren held her first book in hand, a collection of her writings since she was 6. The cover featured 3 paper cranes and a title: "The One Who Called Me by My Name." Hazel had illustrated the cover. Miles composed the music for the book launch. In the foreword, Ren wrote, "We were once torn, but we didn't let the tear define us. We chose to mend with our hands, with trust, and with glances that did not judge." That same day, a news bulletin from the Vatican announced that the Francis Fund would now provide targeted support for abandoned and abuse-surviving children. And among the names listed under Inspiration nominees were Ren and Hazel Marchand, Miles Aiden. Elias saw the names and blinked back tears. He had never forced them to take his name, but they had written it into their lives in their own way. Through essays, through music, through gestures no one had to ask for. The old church, now called the Resurrection Chapel, bore a bronze plaque on its door. For those who were once left behind, now the ones who decide who may enter. And just beneath it, a quote from Pope Francis: "A true community is a place where no one has to ask permission to exist." If you've read this far, maybe your heart has tightened. Or maybe, just a little, it has opened. If you were once a child who had to stay silent to survive, or an adult who turned away out of fear, or someone who once believed they weren't enough to stay, then today, do one small thing. Ask the name of a child you've never said correctly. Look into the eyes of someone you've once avoided. Or simply sit quietly beside someone who's not okay, without needing them to explain. Because as Ren once wrote, no one has to be perfect to stay. Just make sure no one is forced to leave. And if you're still carrying a scar from your past, then let this story say something no one may have told you yet. You survived. And that alone is already beautiful. May tomorrow be a day where you don't have to brace yourself. May you find a place to belong that doesn't need permission. And may someone call you by your true name, even in a quiet voice, but loud enough for you to turn around.